The morning sun rose over Philadelphia Naval Yard on October 15, 1945, casting long shadows across rows of wooden hulls that stretched as far as the eye could see. The air carried the sharp bite of autumn mixed with something else: salt, oil, the lingering ghost of high-octane fuel. And beneath it all, the sweet, almost sickly smell of mahogany slowly rotting in the damp Atlantic air. Lieutenant Commander William Ashford stood at the edge of Pier 7, looking out at what the Navy brass had started calling the fleet nobody wanted. 47 PT boats packed so tightly together that a man could walk from one end of the dock to the other without touching water, gray paint peeling, gun mounts empty, torpedo tubes gaping like toothless mouths. These boats had won a war. 2 months ago, they had been the terror of the Pacific, the scourge of Japanese shipping lanes, the fast attack predators that could appear from nowhere, strike, and vanish before enemy destroyers could even train their guns. Now they sat silent, waiting for a different kind of death. Bill was 37 years old, though the mirror lately suggested otherwise. His brown hair had started going gray at the temples during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. The scar on his left hand a souvenir from when a Japanese machine gun had torn through the bridge of PT-114 still ached when storms rolled in. He had spent 3 years commanding PT boats in combat. He had sent 3 good men to their graves. He had learned to sleep through the sound of torpedo explosions and wake instantly at the whisper of enemy engines. But nothing in those years had prepared him for this. The envelope in his pocket felt heavier than it should. Official Navy stationery. Sealed with the stamp of Admiral Howard Breckinridge, Chief of Naval Operations Logistics Division. Bill had read it 3 times already, but he pulled it out again, hoping the words might have somehow changed. They hadn't. Commander Ashford, you are hereby assigned to the Small Craft Disposal Program, effective immediately. Your primary responsibility will be the assessment, categorization, and liquidation of 812 PT boats currently in Navy inventory across all theaters. Budget allocation $2.8 million. Timeline 18 months. Discretion and efficiency are paramount. 812 boats. $2.8 million. Bill did the math in his head for the 4th time that morning, hoping he had made an error. Each PT boat had cost roughly $400,000 to build. Some of the newer Elco models had run even higher. The total value of the fleet he was supposed to dispose of came to somewhere north of $320 million, and the Navy was giving him less than 1% of that value to make the entire problem disappear. $3,448 per boat. Not to maintain them, not to preserve them, to get rid of them. A sound behind him made Bill turn. A young ensign, fresh-faced and nervous, stood at attention. "Sir Admiral Breckinridge is ready for you." Bill took one last look at the boats, then followed the ensign inside. The Admiral's office occupied the 3rd floor of Building 17 overlooking the yard. Sir. Howard Breckinridge was 55, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that photographs well for Navy recruitment posters. He had spent the war in Washington managing logistics, making the trains run on time. Men like him won wars by counting beans and moving paper. Men like Bill won wars by getting shot at. "Ashford, sit." Bill sat. Breckinridge pushed a file folder across the desk. It was thick, easily 4 inches of paper. "Read it later. Summary: we have PT boats scattered across 47 locations. Pearl Harbor, Manila, Guam, New Orleans, New York, even Alaska. Most are war-weary. Many are damaged. A few are brand new, finished too late to see combat. Your job is to sort them into 4 categories." He held up 4 fingers, ticking them off one by one. Category A, 30 boats maximum. Training vessels, museum pieces, anything with historical significance. Category B boats we can sell to allies. Philippines, Norway, China. Get whatever price you can. Category C boats we dismantle for scrap and parts. Mahogany goes to lumberyards, engines to commercial buyers, bronze fittings to metal dealers. Category D boats we scuttle. Deep water disposal, artificial reefs, target practice. Gone. Bill opened the folder. The first page was a master list, 812 entries. PT 59 through PT 1070. Build dates, service records, battle stars, current locations. "Sir," Bill said carefully, "with all respect, these boats won the Pacific. Every one of them has a story. Men died on them. Men were saved by them. We're talking about history here. Breckinridge's expression didn't change. We're talking about money, Commander. Congress is cutting the Navy budget by 70%. We need aircraft carriers, submarines, and destroyers for whatever comes next. We don't need 800 wooden speedboats designed to fight an enemy that no longer exists. The boats still work, sir. Most of them could be operational within weeks. Operational for what purpose? Breckinridge leaned forward. The Japanese Empire is gone. The German Navy is at the bottom of the Atlantic. Who exactly are we going to fight with T boats? The Soviets? They're our allies. Bill knew better than to argue that point. Reports had been filtering back from Europe for months now. Soviet troops refusing to leave occupied territories. Stalin making demands. Churchill giving speeches about Iron Curtains. The alliance was already fraying, but Bill also knew when to keep his mouth shut. I understand, sir. Good. Breckinridge stood signaling the meeting was over. You have 18 months. I chose you for this assignment because you know these boats, you love these boats, but more importantly, you're practical enough to do what needs to be done. Don't make me regret that choice. Bill stood, saluted, and left. He spent the rest of the day in his new office, a converted supply closet on the first floor that smelled of mildew and old rope. Someone had brought in a desk, a filing cabinet, and a telephone that rang at odd intervals for people who no longer worked there. The folder sat in front of him, still unopened beyond that first page. 812 boats. Bill had commanded PT-114 from June 1942 through August 1944, 26 months. 78 combat missions, 5 confirmed kills, 1 near-death experience that still visited him in dreams. It had been August 12, 1944. Leyte Gulf. PT-114 running dark at 38 knots, hunting a Japanese destroyer that intelligence said was carrying ammunition to reinforce Manila. They had found it. They had gotten off 2 torpedoes before the destroyer's searchlights caught them. And then the world had turned to fire. A 5-inch shell had hit them amidships, punching through the mahogany hull like paper exploding in the engine room. Engine number 2 had disintegrated. Shrapnel had torn through the bridge. Bill's left hand had been laid open to the bone. His helmsman, a kid from Nebraska named Tommy Chen, had taken a piece of metal through the throat and died before they could even get him below deck. But the boat hadn't sunk. The hull, despite the massive hole, had held together long enough for them to limp to friendly waters. Bill had always wondered about that. The mahogany shouldn't have been strong enough. By all rights, PT-114 should have broken apart and sent all 12 men to the bottom. But it didn't. And now, searching through the folder, Bill found PT-114's entry, current location New Orleans, Louisiana, Higgins Industries Shipyard, status scheduled for Category C disposal, dismantling contract awarded. Bill stared at the words for a long time. Then he kept reading. The list went on and on, familiar hull numbers. PT-109, the boat that had made Jack Kennedy famous, already preserved and politically untouchable. PT-59, the boat Bill had served on before getting his own command. PT-323, commanded by his academy classmate who had died at Okinawa. And then on page 47, Bill found something that didn't make sense. 9 boats with entries that looked wrong. PT-347, PT-563, PT-891, PT-1012, PT-1045, PT-1063, PT-1087, PT-1099, PT-1108. All Elco 80-footers, the fastest class ever built. All withdrawn from combat zones in August and September 1945, right after Japan surrendered. All currently listed with the same cryptic notation, administrative transfer pending further review. No category assignment, no location given, just that one line. Bill picked up the phone and called the officer in charge of the Manila depot where 3 of the boats had last been recorded. Commander Phillips answered on the 3rd ring. Bill could hear the exhaustion in his voice. Everyone was exhausted these days. Phillips, this is Ashford in Philadelphia. I'm trying to track down some boats from your inventory. PT-347, PT-563, and PT-891. Your records show them departing Manila in September. Do you have any idea where they went? There was a long pause. Ashford, I got orders from Washington to release those boats, signed by someone I'd never heard of. They pulled out on September 18th, middle of the night. Skeleton crews. No weapons, no Navy markings. I asked questions. I was told not to ask questions. Who took them? Another pause. Longer this time. I don't know. But the sailors who remained behind, they talked. Said the officers spoke English but weren't Navy. Said the boats were going somewhere classified. One of my chiefs swore he saw OSS insignia on a duffel bag. OSS, Office of Strategic Services. America's wartime intelligence agency, the shadowy organization that ran spies and saboteurs and operations that Congress never heard about. Thanks, Phillips. Bill hung up and stared at the 9 entries. 9 boats worth $3.5 million just gone. He was still staring when he heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy boots, deliberate, the kind of walk that said military but not Navy. The door opened without a knock. The man who entered was tall, maybe 6'2", with shoulders that suggested he had played football in another life. He wore civilian clothes, a gray suit that looked expensive, and his eyes had the flat, evaluating stare of someone who had seen violence and wasn't impressed by it. Commander Ashford Carter Weston, I work for the government. He didn't offer a handshake. He didn't sit down. He just stood there, taking up space, radiating authority. What part of the government? Bill asked. The part that doesn't have a building with its name on it. Weston glanced at the folder on the desk. I hear you're in charge of disposing of our PT boat fleet. Important work. The Navy appreciates your service. Bill caught the subtle emphasis. Not a building with its name on it. That meant intelligence. Probably CIA, though the agency was still being formed from OSS remnants. Definitely not someone who answered to normal chains of command. What do you want, Mr. Weston? I want to make your job easier. Weston pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and placed it on the desk. It was a list. 9 hull numbers. The same 9 boats. These vessels are no longer your concern, Weston said. Consider them already disposed of. Don't ask where they are. Don't include them in any reports to Congress. Don't mention them to Admiral Breckinridge. They never existed. Are we clear? Bill looked at the paper, then at Weston. These boats are Navy property. I can't just erase them from inventory without documentation. You can and you will. Weston's voice didn't rise, but something in it hardened. This comes from the top commander. From people who don't like being questioned. You served your country well in combat. Don't ruin that record by being difficult now. I need to know what's happening to those boats. No, Weston said, you really don't. He turned and walked out, leaving the list behind. Bill sat in silence for 5 minutes, then 10. Then he picked up the phone and called the one person in Washington who might give him a straight answer. The phone rang at 8 times before someone picked up. Congressman Malone's office. This is Commander William Ashford, Navy. I need to speak with the congressman. It's urgent. Another pause. Whispered consultation. Then a different voice, older, tired. Ashford, this is Henry Malone. I remember you from the appropriations hearing in '43. What's wrong? Bill told him about the 9 boats, about Weston, about the list. Malone listened without interrupting. When Bill finished, there was a long silence on the line. Commander, I'm going to give you some advice. Take it or leave it. Those boats you're asking about, they're a part of something called Operation Redwood. I'm not supposed to know about it. You're definitely not supposed to know about it. The short version is that some people in the OSS decided we needed assets in certain parts of the world. Fast boats that could move people and materials without attracting attention. Boats that officially don't exist. That's illegal. That's politics, Malone said quietly. And if you try to fight it, you'll lose your job, your pension, and any chance of ever working in government again. These people play rough, son. My advice, list those 9 boats as combat losses. Nobody will question it. Move on with your life. Sir, with respect. No respect needed, Commander. I'm giving you the truth. Sometimes the truth is that you can't win. Sometimes the best you can do is survive. The line went dead. Bill sat at his desk until the sun went down and the yard grew quiet. Then he opened the bottom drawer, pulled out a bottle of bourbon he'd been saving for a better occasion, and poured himself 3 fingers. He thought about Tommy Chen bleeding out on the bridge of Pete 114. Thought about the mahogany hull holding together long enough to save their lives. Thought about the woman who had built that boat, whoever she was, pouring skill and care into every plank. And he thought about 9 boats disappearing into the shadows, while the rest of the fleet got chopped up for scrap. Bill had joined the Navy because he believed in something: honor, duty, transparency, the idea that America was different, better, because it didn't operate in shadows. That belief was getting harder to hold on to. He was on his second glass when something slid under his door. An envelope. Plain, unmarked. Bill opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 lines typed in the center. PT3, 47 PT, 563, PT, 891 are not the only boats that have disappeared. Ask Admiral Breckenridge about the Chinese contracts. Ask him why Margaret Chen is still being paid by Higgins Industries after she stopped working there. No signature, no return address. Bill read it twice, then held it over the wastepaper basket ready to strike a match and burn it. Instead, he folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. Tomorrow, he would start making phone calls. Tomorrow, he would begin the impossible task of destroying 800 boats while trying to figure out who was stealing them and why. Tomorrow, he would meet the woman whose name kept appearing in places it shouldn't. But tonight, he sat alone in his office and wondered how many other secrets were hiding in that 4-inch folder, and whether knowing the truth was worth the price he suspected it would cost. The bourbon bottle was half empty when Bill finally left the office at midnight. The PT boats sat silent in the darkness, hulls creaking against their moorings, waiting for judgment. 812 boats. Some would survive. Most would die. And 9, maybe more, would simply vanish as if they had never existed at all. Bill walked past them, his footsteps echoing on the wooden pier, and tried not to think about which category each one deserved. Tried not to think about the men who had bled on those decks. Tried not to think about the craftsmen who had built them with pride. Tried not to think about the fact that winning a war meant destroying the very tools that had won it. He failed at all of those things. But he kept walking anyway, because that's what you did when orders came down and the bourbon ran out and the world refused to make sense anymore. You kept walking, you saluted the flag, you did your job, and you tried not to count the canal. November 3rd, 1945. New Orleans, Louisiana. Margaret Chen stood in the early morning fog at Higgins Industries shipyard looking at a boat she had built with her own hands 3 years earlier. PT-218 sat in dry dock, stripped of weapons, emptied of fuel, waiting to die. Maggie could see her own work in every line of the hull, the way the mahogany planks curved just so at the bow, the slight irregularity in the third strake from waterline where she'd had to compensate for a knot in the wood. The brass fittings she'd insisted on polishing herself because the new workers didn't understand that salt water would eat through anything less than perfect. She had been 25 years old when she'd built P-218, young, angry, determined to prove that a Chinese-American woman could do any job a white man could do and do it better. Now she was 27 and her job was to take it apart. The shipyard had changed since the war ended. 2 months ago, 3,000 workers had crowded these docks, building PT boats as fast as lumber and engines could arrive. The sound of hammers and saws had filled the air from dawn until midnight, 7 days a week. Women and men working side by side, united by purpose, building the tools that would win the war. Now fewer than 300 workers remained. The hammers were silent, the saws stood idle, and the boats they had built with such pride sat waiting for demolition. Maggie climbed aboard P-218, her work boots solid on the deck she remembered laying. The wood creaked under her weight, familiar as an old friend's voice. She had built 47 PT boats during the war. 47, each one taking between 8 and 12 weeks from keel to launch depending on material availability and design changes. Each one receiving the same meticulous attention, the same refusal to accept anything less than perfection. Her father had taught her that. Liang Chen, master carpenter immigrant from Guangdong province, who had opened a small furniture shop in San Francisco, only to watch it burn during the anti-Chinese riots of 1919. He had rebuilt. They had burned it again. He had rebuilt again because that's what you did. You kept building, you kept trying, you refused to let hate win. Maggie had inherited his hands, long fingers surprisingly strong, capable of feeling flaws in wood that eyes couldn't see. And she had inherited his stubbornness. In 1942, when Higgins Industries had started hiring women for the war effort, Maggie had lied about her experience. Told them she'd been working construction for years. Showed them calluses that actually came from helping her father in the furniture shop. Got hired as a basic laborer. Within 6 months, she'd been promoted to lead carpenter. Within a year, foreman. The white men resented her. The white women didn't know what to make of her. The few other Asian American workers kept their distance, afraid association might bring trouble. But nobody could argue with her work. PT-218 was proof of that. The boat had survived 2 years of combat in the Pacific, had taken damage from Japanese aircraft shore batteries, and even a kamikaze near miss that had killed 2 crew members but left the hull intact. It had limped back to port 3 times with holes that should have sunk it, but it hadn't sunk, because Maggie had built it right, and now she was going to tear it apart. Chen, the voice made Maggie turn. Dutch Morrison stood at the dock's edge, clipboard in hand, expression sour. He was 45 years old, heavy around the middle, with the kind of face that looked like it was perpetually smelling something bad. He'd been her supervisor during the war, resenting every promotion she'd received, every commendation that should have been his. "You gonna stand there all morning or you gonna work?" Maggie climbed down from the boat. "Just checking structural integrity. Want to make sure we can salvage the maximum amount of material." Navy don't care about maximum. They care about fast. You got 6 days per boat, not 7, 6. We're behind quota as it is. 6 days to dismantle what had taken 10 weeks to build. Maggie had done the math last night, unable to sleep. Higgins Industries had a contract to dismantle 127 PT boats over the next 8 months. They were paying her $60 a week to supervise a crew of 12 men, most of whom had never worked a boat in their lives. $60 a week to destroy her own work. It was good money. Better than she could make anywhere else as a woman, and certainly better than she could make as a Chinese-American woman in 1945 America. Her father was sick, her mother was getting old. The furniture shop wasn't bringing in enough income. Maggie needed this job. She hated this job, but she needed it. "I'll have PT-218 done in 5 days, she told Dutch. 4 would be better. 5, Maggie repeated, "and it'll be done right. Every piece of salvageable mahogany properly stored, every brass fitting cataloged, every engine component tested before removal. That's what the contract says." Dutch's face darkened. "Don't quote the contract at me, Chen. I was building boats before you were born. Then you should understand why rushing leads to waste." For a moment, Maggie thought he might actually yell at her. His face went red, his jaw clenched. But then he just turned and walked away, muttering something under his breath that probably wasn't a compliment. Maggie watched him go, then turned back to PT-218. Her crew arrived at 7. 12 men ranging from teenagers to retirees, none with serious boat-building experience. The Navy was paying rock-bottom wages for demolition work, so they got rock-bottom workers. Maggie had tried to train them properly, had shown them how to remove planking without splitting it, how to extract brass screws without stripping them, how to disconnect engine mounts without damaging the frames. Some learned, most didn't care. To them, this was just wood and metal, material to be processed, weighed, sold. They didn't see the hours of skilled labor, didn't see the precision, didn't see the difference between a boat hastily thrown together and one built with pride. Maggie saw all of it. "All right," she called out. "Same process as yesterday. We start with armament removal. Everything gets cataloged. Nothing gets thrown away. Questions?" Silence. The men shuffled their feet, unwilling to meet her eyes. Half of them still weren't comfortable taking orders from a woman. The other half weren't comfortable taking orders from someone Chinese. But they needed jobs as much as she did. "Let's move." The work began. First, the weapons. PT-218 had mounted one 40mm Bofors gun, 4 20mm Oerlikon cannons, and 8 50 caliber machine guns. All had been removed months ago, sent to depots for storage or redistribution. But the mounts remained, and those had to come off. 2 men with cutting torches began work on the Bofors mount while Maggie supervised. The metal had to be cut carefully to preserve the teak deck underneath. One wrong angle and they damaged wood worth $20 per board foot. While they worked, Maggie descended into the engine room. This was the heart of any PT boat. Three Packard Marine engines, each producing 1,500 horsepower, each weighing 1,200 pounds. These particular engines had run for roughly 800 hours in combat conditions. They'd been maintained well, the logbook showed, with regular oil changes and careful monitoring of temperatures. They were probably good for another 1,000 hours of operation. Instead, they'd be sold to commercial fishing operations for $200 each, a fraction of their value. A waste of engineering. Maggie ran her hand over engine number 2, feeling the cold metal. Somewhere in the Pacific, this engine had pushed PT 218 to 43 knots, while Japanese shells churned the water around it. Somewhere it had kept running even after near-miss explosions had thrown the boat sideways. Somewhere it had brought 12 men home alive. Now it was scrap. She found the maintenance log tucked into a cubby near the helm. Every entry carefully recorded in neat handwriting. Times, temperatures, oil pressure repairs. The last entry was dated August 30th, 1945. All systems normal. PT 218 ready for continued service. Maggie closed the logbook and started to put it back. That's when she noticed the second book. It had been wedged behind the official log, hidden in the shadows. Smaller, personal, not Navy issue. Maggie pulled it out and opened to the first page. Personal log, gunner's mate, second class Michael Riley. She flipped through pages. These weren't official entries. These were stories, memories. The kind of things sailors wrote when they were lonely and scared and wanted someone to remember they'd existed. May 15th, 1944. Patrol near Bougainville. Skipper says we got a destroyer in our sights. I'm scared shitless, but trying not to show it. Tommy keeps cracking jokes. Kid's got nerves of steel. Or he's crazy. Maybe both. June 3rd, 1944. Lost Tommy today. Jap fighter strafed us. He was on the 50 cal, didn't have time to take cover. Doc couldn't save him. Skipper looked like he aged 10 years. We all did. Maggie turned pages, reading fragments of lives she'd never known. Men who had lived and fought on this boat. Men who had trusted the hull she'd built to keep them alive. She reached the last entries. August 1945. August 29th. War's over. Can't quite believe it. We're headed back to the States. Skipper says we'll probably be decommissioned. Strange to think P-218 won't exist much longer. She kept us alive through hell. Feels wrong to just throw her away. August 30th, last patrol. Everything normal. Hard to believe this is the end. Then a final entry dated September 15th, weeks after the official logs had stopped. September 15th. Strangest thing happened today. Skipper got called to meet with some officers I didn't recognize. Not Navy. When he came back, he looked shaken. Wouldn't talk about it. That night, we saw PT-347 pull out of harbor. No lights, no radio chatter, just gone. Next morning, PT-563 did the same thing. Disappeared like ghosts. Skipper said not to ask questions. But I'm asking anyway, what the hell is going on? Where are these boats going? Maggie read that last entry 3 times. PT-347 and PT-563. 2 boats pulling out in secret. No official record. Just vanishing in the night. She thought about mentioning it to Dutch, then decided against it. He'd just tell her to mind her own business. And maybe he'd be right. But Maggie folded the log carefully and slipped it into her jacket pocket anyway. The rest of the morning passed in poison heat. Cutting torches hissing, metal clanging, men cursing when tools slipped or materials proved stubborn. By noon, they'd removed all the weapon mounts and started on the electrical systems. Maggie supervised corrected mistakes, demonstrated proper techniques that half the crew ignored. Her back ached. Her hands were filthy, despite her gloves. And the whole time she couldn't stop thinking about those 2 boats disappearing in the night. Lunch break came at 12:30. Most of the crew wandered off to a diner down the street. Maggie stayed behind eating a sandwich her mother had packed that morning and reading through more of the personal log. She was on page 47 when a shadow fell across her. Miss Chen. The voice had an accent, not heavy but definitely present. Eastern European, maybe Russian. Maggie looked up. The man standing before her was tall, maybe 6 feet, with dark hair and blue eyes that seemed too sharp, too observant. He wore a suit that looked expensive, but not flashy, and his hands were clean in a way that suggested he didn't do manual labor. I'm Alex Volkov, he said, offering his hand. I represent Pan American Maritime Consulting. We're interested in purchasing salvaged materials from decommissioned military vessels. Maggie shook his hand cautiously. His grip was firm but not aggressive. Materials are sold through official Navy contracts. You'll need to talk to the front office. I have Volkov said smoothly, but I was hoping to speak directly with someone who understands the quality of what's being salvaged. The office mentioned you were the lead supervisor. What exactly are you looking to buy? Mahogany primarily, marine grade properly seasoned. We have clients in Central America building luxury yachts. American mahogany is considered superior. We're willing to pay above market rate for guaranteed quality. He quoted a price. It was indeed above market, significantly so. Maggie's suspicions deepened. Why pay extra when you can get the same materials cheaper through normal channels? Volkov smiled. It didn't quite reach his eyes. Quality assurance, speed of delivery, and discretion. Sometimes our clients prefer transactions that don't generate excessive paperwork. There it was, the hint of something not quite legal. I can't help you, Maggie said. Everything I salvage goes to official buyers. If you want mahogany, go through proper channels. Of course. Volkov didn't seem offended. I understand completely. But if circumstances change, if you find yourself with materials that might otherwise go to waste, I hope you'll consider our offer. He handed her a business card. Plain white, just a name and phone number. No company logo, no address. Thank you for your time, Miss Chen. He walked away before she could refuse the card. Maggie looked at it for a long moment, then tucked it into her pocket next to the logbook. The afternoon was worse than the morning. Engine number 2 proved difficult to extract. The mounting bolts had corroded, requiring careful application of penetrating oil and patience. One of the crew members got impatient and tried forcing it, nearly cracking the engine block. Maggie had to send him off the boat before she said something that would get her fired. By 4 o'clock, they'd removed all 3 engines and started dismantling the hull. This was the part Maggie hated most. Watching the mahogany planks get pried up, seeing gaps appear in the smooth curves she'd so carefully shaped. Each plank had to be inspected, graded, and sorted. Grade A went to furniture makers. Grade B went to general construction. Grade C went to pulp mills. PT 218 was mostly Grade A. Maggie had built it that way. By 6 o'clock, when the whistle blew ending the workday, they'd removed roughly a third of the starboard hull. At this rate, they'd finish in 5 days as promised. The crew filed out eager to get home, or to bars, or to wherever men went when they wanted to forget the day's work. Maggie stayed behind, as she always did, making notes on what needed to be done tomorrow, checking that all tools were properly stored, ensuring nothing valuable had been carelessly discarded. She was alone on the dock when she noticed the propeller. It shouldn't have been there. Propellers were supposed to be removed by specialized crews sent to metal recyclers who would weigh them and pay by the pound. But this one sat in a pile of scrap metal near the dock's edge, bronze gleaming in the fading light. 80 pounds of bronze worth at least $60. Someone had been careless, or lazy, or both. Maggie looked around. The yard was empty. The security guard was making his rounds at the far end of the facility. She thought about the business card in her pocket, about Volkov's offer to pay above market rates with minimal paperwork. She thought about her father coughing blood into handkerchiefs he tried to hide from her mother. She thought about $60 a week, barely covering rent and medicine. And she thought about how nobody would miss one propeller from a boat scheduled to be completely scrapped anyway. Maggie had never stolen anything in her life, but she picked up that propeller, heavy as a small child, and carried it to her truck. She told herself it wasn't stealing, just salvaging, just making sure valuable materials didn't go to waste. She told herself a lot of things on the drive home. None of them made her feel better. But the propeller stayed in her truck, and when she got home to the small house she shared with her parents in the French Quarter, she didn't mention it. Just kissed her mother goodnight, checked on her father who was already asleep, and went to her own room. There she pulled out the personal log and read the last entry again. PT 347 and PT 563 disappearing in the night. Boats that weren't supposed to exist anymore. Just like the propeller in her truck. Maggie fell asleep thinking about secrets and laws and the things people did when the world stopped making sense. She dreamed about her brother Johnny, who had died at Iwo Jima in February 1945, serving on a PT boat that had been rammed and sunk by a Japanese destroyer. In the dream, he stood on the deck of PT 218, young and whole and smiling. "You built a good boat, sis," he said. "It would have saved me if I'd been on it." Then he faded into mist, and Maggie woke with tears on her face. It was still dark outside. 3 in the morning, maybe 4. She lay in bed listening to her father cough in the next room and wondered how many more boats she'd have to destroy before this job was done. 127, her contract said. 126 to go. Maggie closed her eyes and tried not to count the cost. The next 2 weeks blurred together in a haze of demolition and deception. Maggie dismantled PT-218 in 4.5 days, impressing even Dutch Morrison with her efficiency. Then PT-3, 3, 4. Then PT-412. Each boat came apart under her hands like a puzzle being solved in reverse. And with each boat she saved something. A brass nameplate here, a ship's wheel there, a section of particularly fine mahogany that she couldn't bear to see ground into furniture scraps. She told herself she was preserving history, creating a memorial for Johnny and all the other sailors who'd never come home. She didn't think too hard about the fact that she was also building inventory. Volkov returned on November 17th, appearing at the shipyard just as the evening shift was ending. He wore a different suit this time, charcoal gray, and carried a leather briefcase that looked European. "Miss Chen, I was hoping to catch you." Maggie glanced around. The yard was mostly empty, but Dutch's office light was still on. "I told you I can't help with materials." "I understand. But I heard through mutual acquaintances that you might have some items of personal interest. Not for sale through official channels. Just pieces you're keeping as mementos." Maggie's heart began to pound. Had someone seen her taking things? "Was this a trap? I don't know what you're talking about." Volkov's expression didn't change. "Of course not. But if you did happen to have, say, a bronze propeller or some other items of historical significance, I know collectors who would pay generously. 5 times the scrap value. Cash. No paperwork. No questions. 5 times. That would be $300 for the propeller alone. 3 months of her father's medicine." "Why?" Maggie asked quietly. "Why do you care about old boat parts?" For the first time, Volkov's professional mask slipped slightly. Something almost like genuine emotion crossed his face. "Because I understand what it means to build something with your hands and watch it be destroyed. In my country, we have lost much. Art, architecture, history, all destroyed by war. When I see craftsmanship like yours being thrown away, it offends something in me. So I try to save what I can." It was a good lie, or maybe it was partially true. Maggie couldn't tell. "I need to think about it," she said. "Take your time, but not too much time. I'm only in New Orleans for another 2 weeks. After that, the opportunity closes." He handed her another card. This one had an address, a warehouse in the industrial district. "If you decide you have anything to sell, come here. Anytime before December 1st. Day or night, someone will be there." Then he was gone, disappearing into the New Orleans dusk like smoke. Maggie stood alone on the dock, the card burning in her pocket like a coal. She went home that night and counted the parts she'd saved. 1 propeller, 2 ship's wheels, 3 nameplates, various brass fittings and instruments. Maybe $800 worth if Volkov's price was real. Almost a year of her father's medicine. She thought about Johnny, about the boat that should have saved him but didn't, about all the boats she'd built with pride that were now being chopped up for scrap. And she thought about the 2 boats that had disappeared. PT-3, 47, and PT-563. Boats that somebody had wanted badly enough to take them in the middle of the night. If the government could steal boats, why couldn't she save a few parts? The logic was twisted, she knew that. But it was 3 in the morning, and her father was coughing in the next room, and she was so tired of being powerless. Maggie made her decision. The next morning, instead of going directly to the shipyard, she drove to the address Volkov had given her. A warehouse near the river, old brick building that looked abandoned from the outside. She knocked on a side door. It opened immediately. Volkov stood there looking unsurprised to see her. "Miss Chen, please come in." The interior was cleaner than she'd expected. Not fancy, but organized. Crates stacked neatly, a desk in one corner with paperwork, and along one wall covered with tarp shapes that looked like boat parts. "You already have a collection," Maggie said. "Small pieces, nothing as significant as what you've saved." Volkov gestured to a chair. Would you like coffee? No, I want to sell what I have and leave. Of course, Volkov sat across from her. But first I have a proposition. Something more significant than buying a few parts. Maggie's instincts screamed warning, but she'd come this far. What kind of proposition? Volkov leaned forward. Miss Chen, you're talented, the best boat carpenter I've ever seen documentation for. And you understand these vessels intimately. You built 47 of them. You know every detail of their construction. So, so what if instead of dismantling boats, you could save an entire boat, intact? Maggie stared at him. That's insane. The Navy tracks every boat. You can't just steal one. Not steal, preserve. There are boats sitting in storage right now, Category A, boats waiting to be moved to training facilities. Fueled, maintained, ready to sail. What if one of those boats simply disappeared, went to a private collector who would maintain it properly? Keep it as history should be kept. And this private collector would pay how much? $50,000. The number hit Maggie like a physical blow. $50,000, more money than she'd earn in 10 years. Enough to save her father, buy a house, start over. That's illegal. So is taking government property without authorization, which you've already done. Volkov's voice was gentle, not threatening, just stating facts. I'm not judging you, Miss Chen. I'm offering you a better option. One boat saved instead of destroyed. Your father's life saved. Everyone wins, except the Navy. And the Navy that's scrapping 800 boats? The Navy that doesn't value your work or your brother's sacrifice. That Navy, Maggie wanted to argue, wanted to walk out. But the number kept echoing in her head. $50,000. How would it even work? She heard herself ask. Volkov smiled. That's what we need to discuss. But first you need to understand something important. This isn't just about saving a boat. My employers are very interested in PT boat technology. They want to understand how they're built. What makes them so fast and effective? If you help me acquire a boat and document its construction, you'd be providing valuable information to people who want to preserve naval heritage. Something in his phrasing finally clicked. Your employers aren't yacht collectors. They're a government. Volkov didn't deny it. Does that change anything? A boat gets saved either way. It changes everything. This isn't preservation. This is espionage. Such dramatic words. Volkov stood walking to the covered shapes along the wall. He pulled back a tarp, revealing a perfectly preserved P boat engine. This is a Packard V12, 1,500 horsepower, the finest marine engine ever built. Your Navy is selling these for scrap, $200 each. Criminal, really. My employers will study this engine, learn from it, build better boats. And somewhere because of what you preserve, sailors will come home alive, just like your brother should have. He was good. Maggie had to give him that. He'd found every pressure point and pushed expertly. I need time to think. You have 3 days. December 1st, I leave New Orleans. Either you come with a plan for acquiring a boat or you take your propeller money and we never speak again. But know this. Volkov's voice hardened slightly. I've invested time in you, Miss Chen. If you go to the authorities about this conversation, things will become complicated. Very complicated. For you and your family. There it was, the threat beneath the courtesy. Maggie stood on shaking legs. I need air. Of course, the door is unlocked, but think carefully about your decision. $50,000, your father's life, or $60 a week demolishing history. Maggie walked out into the cold November morning and got in her truck. Her hands shook so badly she could barely grip the steering wheel. She'd come to sell a propeller and some brass fittings. She was leaving with a choice that would define the rest of her life. Over the next 3 days, Maggie didn't sleep more than a few hours total. She worked on PT 521 during the day, going through the motions of demolition, while her mind spun through possibilities. She could go to the police, tell them about Volkov, about his offer, but he'd made it clear he had information about her thefts, and she couldn't prove he'd offered anything illegal. A good lawyer would make her look like a criminal trying to extort money with false accusations. She could just take the propeller money and walk away. But $60 a week while her father died slowly wasn't walking away, it was drowning in place. She could take the 50,000 and justify it as saving a boat, but she'd be betraying her country, helping a foreign power acquire American military technology. That made her a traitor, no matter how she rationalized it. On the third night, she sat beside her father's bed while he slept. He looked so small now, diminished by illness. Liang Chen, who had rebuilt his shop 3 times, who had taught her that work done with pride mattered more than money, who had never compromised his principles even when it cost him everything. What would he say if he knew what she was considering? Maggie knew the answer to that. He'd tell her that honor was all a person had, that you couldn't sell your soul even to save a life, that some prices were too high. She also knew what her mother would say, that principles didn't matter if you were dead. That family came first. That surviving meant doing hard things. December 1st arrived. Maggie called in sick to work the first time in 3 years. Then she drove to Volkov's warehouse. He was waiting as if he'd known she'd come. "Miss Chen, you've made your decision." Maggie took a deep breath. "Tell me exactly what you need." Volkov's smile was genuine this time. "First, I need information. Which boats are Category A? Where are they stored? What's the security situation? Then when we've identified the right target, I need your expertise to help acquire it. And finally, I need you to document the construction details. Hull layup, engine installation, everything. In the 50,000, 3,000 now, 10,000 when you provide the information I need, the balance when we successfully acquire the boat. What if we get caught? We won't. I have resources you can't imagine. But if something goes wrong, you'll have enough money to disappear. New identity, new life far from here." Maggie thought about her father, about Johnny, about the 47 boats she'd built with pride. And she thought about PT-347 and PT-563 disappearing in the night. If the government could make boats vanish for secret operations, was what she was doing really so different? "I want the first 3,000 now, and I want your word that my family won't be harmed if anything goes wrong." "You have both." Volkov opened his briefcase and pulled out an envelope. $3,000, cash. Count it if you'd like. Maggie did. The bills were real, more money than she'd ever held at one time. "There are boats in storage at Port Everglades, Florida," she heard herself saying. "Category A boats, 22 of them. Elco 80-footers, the best class ever built. They're waiting to be transported to Philadelphia for training use. Minimal security, just 2 guards and a chain-link fence." Volkov was writing rapidly in a notebook. "How do you know this?" "I built 3 of those boats, and I have a friend in logistics who told me about the transfer schedule." It was a lie. She'd seen a memo on Dutch's desk 2 days ago while he was at lunch. Had memorized the details because some part of her had already known she'd need them. "Excellent. And you can identify which boat would be best to take. PT-658. Newest hull, just had engines overhauled. Best maintained. Fuel tanks probably already filled for the transfer." "Perfect." Volkov closed his notebook. "I'll arrange transportation and support. We'll need to move quickly. Within 2 weeks. Can you get to Florida?" "I can tell my supervisor I have a family emergency." "Good. I'll contact you with details." Volkov extended his hand. "Welcome to the team, Miss Chen. You're doing important work." Maggie shook his hand, feeling the envelope heavy in her other palm. $3,000, first installment on her father's life. Down payment on her soul. She drove home in a daze, the money hidden under her truck seat. When she arrived, her mother was in the kitchen making soup. "Maggie, you're home early. Are you feeling better?" "Yes, Mama, much better." Her father called from the bedroom. "Maggie, that you?" She went to him. He was sitting up, looking slightly better than yesterday. The medicine was working for now. "How was work, daughter?" "Same as always, Ba. Building boats and taking them apart." "You do good work. I'm proud of you." Maggie's eyes burned. "I know, Ba." That night she lay in bed and tried to convince herself she'd made the right choice. Tried to believe that saving her father justified betraying everything else. Tried to ignore the voice in her head that sounded like Johnny asking what the hell she thought she was doing. She failed at all of those things. But the money stayed hidden under her truck seat. And when Volkov called 3 days later with details about traveling to Florida, she said yes, because she'd already crossed the line. And there was no going back now. 10 days after Bill received the anonymous note, he made the phone call that would change everything. The number belonged to Higgins Industries, New Orleans. The woman who answered sounded tired, like someone who'd been answering phones for too many years and expected nothing good to come from any of them. Higgins Industries, how may I direct your call? Personnel records, please. A click, a wait. Then a different voicemail, younger. Personnel, how can I help you? This is Commander William Ashford, United States Navy Small Craft Disposal Program. I need employment verification for one of your workers. Margaret Chen. She's listed as lead carpenter on the PT boat dismantling contract. Papers rustling. The sound of filing cabinets opening and closing. Margaret Chen. Yes, sir, I have her file. Hired April 1942 as general laborer. Promoted to lead carpenter June 1943. Current position is demolition supervisor. Is there a problem? No problem, just routine verification. Can you tell me what boat she worked on during construction? More rustling. Looks like she was involved in 47 vessels total. PT 109 through PT 218, various others. Excellent work record. Multiple commendations. Why do you ask? Bill hesitated. The question he wanted to ask wasn't the kind you asked over official channels, but the anonymous note in his pocket had mentioned her name specifically, and he needed to know why. Did Miss Chen ever have contact with classified programs? Any special projects outside normal production? A pause, longer than it should have been. Sir, I'd need authorization from my supervisor to discuss anything beyond basic employment information. I have authorization from Admiral Breckenridge's office. Bill didn't, but he was gambling. The clerk wouldn't check. This is a matter of operational security. Another pause. Then quietly, there was an incident last year, March 1944. Miss Chen was questioned by Naval Intelligence about potential security breaches. Someone reported her for asking too many questions about where boats were being deployed. Investigation cleared her completely. Found she was just conscientious about her work, wanted to know if her boats were performing well in combat. Was she ever approached by foreign agents, Soviets, anyone suspicious? Not that I'm aware of, sir, but her file does note that she lost a brother in combat. February 1945. He was serving on a PT boat that was rammed and sunk by a Japanese destroyer at Iwo Jima. She took it hard according to her supervisor. Started making mistakes. Almost got fired. But she pulled herself together. Bill wrote that down. A brother killed on a PT boat. That explained a lot about why someone might care deeply about the vessels, might want to preserve parts, even if it meant bending rules. Thank you. One more question. Has anyone else requested information about Miss Chen recently? Silence on the line. Then that's an odd question, sir. Has anyone? Actually, yes. About 2 weeks ago, man with an accent, Eastern European maybe, said he was with a maritime consulting firm, wanted to verify her credentials for a potential job offer. We gave him basic information only. Employment dates, position titles. Nothing sensitive. Bill felt something cold settle in his stomach. Did he give a name? Let me check. Yes, here it is. Alex Volkov, Pan American Maritime Consulting. Bill thanked the clerk and hung up. Then he pulled out the file folder and started looking for a pattern. It took him 3 hours cross-referencing locations, dates, and personnel assignments. But eventually he found it. Every shipyard that was currently dismantling PT boats had reported at least one visit from representatives of Pan American Maritime Consulting. Every location had the same story, well-dressed men with accents offering above-market prices for materials, asking detailed questions about procedures and personnel. And in every case, the inquiries had started within days of the Navy announcing the disposal program. Someone was very interested in PT boats, someone with resources and organization, someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. Bill picked up the phone again. This time he called FBI headquarters in Washington. Special Agent Robert Hendricks answered on the second ring. Bill had met him during the war when Naval Intelligence and the FBI had cooperated on a counter-espionage case involving German saboteurs. Hendricks was sharp, thorough, and had a reputation for getting results without caring whose toes he stepped on. Hendricks, Bill Ashford, I need a favor. Ashford, heard you got stuck with boat disposal duty. My condolences. What do you need? Background check on a company called Pan American Maritime Consulting, and on a man named Alex Volkov who works for them. Volkov, Hendricks said the name, slowly tasting it. Give me 10 minutes. He called back in 8. Your instincts are good, Commander. Pan American Maritime Consulting doesn't exist. Post office box in New York, telephone number that forwards to a hotel switchboard. No business license, no tax records, no employees except for people who don't seem to exist on paper. And Volkov, that's where it gets interesting. We have 3 different Alex Volkovs who've entered the United States in the past year. 2 are legitimate accountants for Soviet trade delegations. The third entered through New York in September on a diplomatic visa listed as cultural attaché to the Soviet consulate. Hasn't been seen at the consulate since October. Our surveillance lost him 3 weeks ago. Cultural attaché, which is what the NKVD calls their intelligence officers when they want them to have diplomatic cover. Commander, what exactly is this about? Bill told him. The PT boat disposal program, the missing boats, the inquiries at shipyards, the mysterious purchases of salvaged materials, and now Margaret Chen. Hendricks listened without interrupting. When Bill finished, there was a long silence. I need to bring this to my supervisor, Hendricks said finally. We've been tracking increased Soviet intelligence activity since the war ended. Stalin wants technology, especially anything that might give him an edge in the next war. PT boats would be high on that list. Fast attack craft proven in combat, relatively cheap to build. If he could reverse engineer them, he could produce hundreds for Baltic and Black Sea operations. Can you stop them? We can try, but diplomatic immunity is tricky. If Volkov is officially attached to the consulate, we can't just arrest him. We need evidence of espionage, and we need to catch him in the act. Hendricks paused. Where do you think he'll strike next? Bill looked at his list. 12 locations were currently dismantling boats, but only 1 had intact vessels that hadn't been touched yet. Port Everglades, Florida. We've got 22 boats in storage there waiting to be moved to Philadelphia for training use. They're Category A boats, the newest and best. If I were trying to steal one intact, that's where I'd go. Then that's where we'll set a trap, Hendricks said. But I need to coordinate this carefully. The CIA wants in on the operation. National security implications, they say. Fellow named Weston from their organization has been asking questions. Bill's blood ran cold. Carter Weston. You know him. He came to my office 2 weeks ago, told me to forget about 9 missing boats. Threatened me if I kept asking questions. Interesting. He didn't mention that when he requested joint operation status. Hendricks paused. Commander, there's something bigger going on here. Those 9 boats, the CIA's interest, now Soviet intelligence targeting the disposal program. This isn't just about stealing technology. This is about secrets both sides want to keep. What do I do? You help us catch Volkov, and you be very careful around Weston. CIA requested he be operational lead since this involves foreign intelligence. I pushed back, but I got overruled. FBI will be there, but Weston's running the show. Bill didn't like that, didn't trust it, but he didn't have a choice. I can be in Florida tomorrow. Do it. And Ashford, if this goes wrong, if Volkov escapes with a boat, both our careers are over. Maybe more than our careers given who's involved. Bill hung up and immediately started packing. He was halfway to the train station when something occurred to him. Margaret Chen worked in New Orleans. Volkov had been asking about her specifically. If she was involved willingly or through coercion, she'd be Volkov's key to identifying which boat to take and how to operate it. Bill needed to warn her or stop her or something, but he also needed to get to Florida before Volkov made his move. He compromised. He called New Orleans FBI field office and asked them to put surveillance on Margaret Chen. Not an arrest, not an interrogation, just watching, just in case. Then he caught the southbound train and tried to sleep while the miles rolled past. He couldn't. His mind kept spinning through possibilities, each one worse than the last. If Volkov had recruited Chen either willingly or through blackmail, he'd have someone who knew PT boats intimately. Someone who could identify which boat would be easiest to steal, which engines were most reliable, which modifications were most important. If Volkov was planning to actually sail a stolen boat out of American waters, he'd need a crew. That meant more NKVD agents, probably disguised as merchant sailors or fishermen positioned along the coast ready to assist. If the Soviets successfully stole an intact PT boat and got it back to Russia, They'd have everything they needed to build their own fleet. Hull designs, engine specifications, weapon mounts, electronics, everything. And Bill would go down in history as the officer who let it happen. The train reached Jacksonville at dawn. Bill transferred to a local line that took him to Fort Lauderdale, then caught a taxi to Port Everglades Naval Auxiliary Field. The facility was small, barely more than a dock and a warehouse guarded by two sailors who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Bill showed his credentials and was waved through without questions. The PT boats sat in neat rows tied to floating docks covered with tarps against the weather. Bill walked among them, checking hull numbers against his list. PT 658, PT 701, PT 724 were all Elco 80-footers, the fastest class ever built, all with recently overhauled engines, all ready to sail at a moment's notice if someone knew what they were doing. Bill climbed aboard PT 658 and pulled back the tarp. The boat was beautiful. 78 feet of sleek mahogany, 3 Packard engines capable of pushing her to 43 knots, enough fuel capacity to reach Cuba or the Bahamas without refueling if you were careful. Someone had maintained her well. The deck was clean, the bright work polished, the engine room organized and spotless. He checked the fuel tanks. Full. That was wrong. Category A boats in storage weren't supposed to be fueled. Too much fire risk. Someone had filled these tanks recently, within the past week, judging by the smell. Bill was examining the engine room when he heard voices outside. He froze listening. 2 men speaking Russian. Bill's Russian was limited learned during wartime intelligence briefings, but he caught enough to understand they were discussing boat schedules and something about meeting someone named Dmitri. He moved to the porthole and looked out carefully. 2 men in civilian work clothes stood on the dock examining PT 658 and PT 701. They looked like dock workers, but something about the way they moved suggested military training. Confident, alert, constantly scanning their surroundings, and they were definitely speaking Russian. Bill waited until they moved on, then slipped off the boat and found a phone. Hendricks answered immediately. "They're already here," Bill said. "At least 2 of them, possibly more. They were scouting the boats. Russian speakers, probably NKVD support crew." "We've got agents in position," Hendricks said. 6 men plus 4 Navy security personnel you requested. Weston arrived this morning with his own team. He's coordinating surveillance from a warehouse across from the facility. We're watching all approaches. If Volkov shows up, we'll see him." "What's the plan?" "Weston wants to let them make their move. Let them actually attempt to steal the boat. That gives us clear evidence of espionage, makes the case airtight. Then we intercept before they can get to international waters. And if something goes wrong, then you get to explain to Admiral Breckinridge how we lost a PT boat to the Russians." Hendricks paused. "Commander Weston's also concerned about those 9 missing boats. He says if this operation goes public, questions will be asked. He's pushing for a clean capture with no publicity, no trial, no media, nothing." "How does he plan to accomplish that?" "I don't know, but I don't like his tone when he talks about it." "Be careful, Ashford." Bill spent the rest of the day preparing. He walked every inch of the facility, identifying sight lines and escape routes. He checked the other boats, ensuring they couldn't be quickly started without keys he now held. He coordinated with the FBI agents, explaining PT boat capabilities and likely theft scenarios. And he waited. Night fell. The temperature dropped. A wind came up from the ocean, bringing the smell of salt and distant storms. Bill sat in the darkened cabin of PT 701, watching PT 658 through night, binoculars positioned where he could see but not be seen. 2 FBI agents were hidden in a warehouse across the dock. 4 more were positioned at the facility perimeter. Navy security was maintaining normal routines to avoid alerting anyone watching. The hours crawled past. 10 o'clock, 11, midnight. At 12:47, headlights appeared at the south gate. A truck moving slowly, lights off once it passed the gate. It stopped near the dock where PT 658 sat waiting. 4 people got out. Bill focused the binoculars. The first man was tall, well-built, moving with the confidence of someone in command. Even in the darkness, Bill recognized the bearing. This had to be Volkov. The second and third men were the Russians he'd seen earlier. The fourth person was smaller, moving differently. Lighter footsteps, more hesitant. A woman. Bill's stomach sank as she stepped into a patch of moonlight, and he saw her face clearly. Margaret Chen. He keyed his radio. Hendricks, we have 4 suspects. Volkov, 2 support personnel, and Margaret Chen from Higgins Industries. They're approaching PT-658 now. Copy that. Hold position. Weston says we wait until they're aboard and attempting to leave. We need them committed to the theft. Bill watched Chen climb onto the boat, watched her move with the familiarity of someone who knew every plank and fitting. She disappeared into the engine room. 30 seconds later, he heard it. The deep rumble of Packard engines coming to life. 1 engine, then 2. Then all 3 settling into a synchronized purr that made the whole boat vibrate with barely contained power. Chen knew what she was doing. She was bringing the boat to full operational status. 2 of the Russians began loading equipment from the truck. Fuel cans, supplies, what looked like communication equipment. They worked quickly, efficiently, like men who'd rehearsed this operation. Volkov stood on the dock watching the perimeter, one hand inside his jacket, where a weapon probably waited. Bill keyed the radio again. Hendricks, they're loading supplies. Looks like they're planning to make a run for it tonight. Let them cast off. Once they're moving, they've committed to the theft. That's when we take them. But something felt wrong to Bill. The operation was too smooth, too practiced. These men had done this before or something very like it. And then he saw it. Another boat running dark without lights approaching from the ocean side. A fishing vessel maybe 40 feet with powerful engines that didn't match its decrepit appearance. Hendricks, we have a support vessel approaching from the east. Fishing boat probably armed. This is bigger than we thought. Copy. Coast Guard cutter is 10 minutes out. Can you delay them? Bill didn't answer. He was already moving. He climbed out of PT-701 and walked quickly toward PD-658. No point hiding now. If they were going to stop this, it had to be immediate. Federal agents! A voice boomed across the dock, amplified by a megaphone. Bill recognized it as Weston's. United States Navy, stop what you're doing and put your hands where we can see them. Floodlights blazed to life, turning night into day. Volkov spun his hand coming out of his jacket with a pistol. The 2 Russians dropped their supplies and scattered. The fishing boat's engines roared as it tried to reverse course. And Margaret Chen, framed in the doorway of PT-658's engine room, froze like a deer in headlights. For one long moment, nobody moved. Then everything happened at once. Volkov fired 3 shots at the floodlights, plunging sections of the dock back into darkness. The Russians returned fire toward the FBI positions. The fishing boat kept coming, now aiming directly for PT-658. Bill ran for the boat, not thinking, just moving on instinct. He had to stop the engines, had to prevent them from escaping. He was halfway there when Chen saw him. Their eyes met. Recognition flashed across her face. Then confusion. Then something like despair. Get off the boat, Bill shouted. Now, before this gets worse. Instead, she disappeared back into the engine room. The engines roared higher. PT-658 lurched against its moorings, straining to break free. Bill jumped aboard just as the boat tore away from the dock, mooring lines snapping like thread. He stumbled, caught himself on a stanchion, pulled himself toward the helm. Chen was at the throttles, pushing them forward. The boat surged ahead, throwing up a white wake that gleamed in the remaining lights. Behind them, gunfire continued. FBI agents were shooting at the fishing boat. The Russians were shooting back. It was chaos. Bill reached the helm and grabbed Chen's arm. Stop! You don't understand what you're doing. She wrenched free, surprisingly strong. I understand perfectly. I'm not going to prison. I'm not going to let them destroy me. They're using you. Volkov is NKVD, Soviet intelligence. You're not salvaging parts. You're committing espionage. I don't care. Her voice cracked. I needed the money. My father is dying. Nobody cares about us. Nobody cares about these boats. So why shouldn't I save what I can? The boat was doing 30 knots now, heading for open water. The fishing vessel was trying to intercept. But PT-658 was faster. Bill looked back. The dock was receding. Muzzle flashes still sparked in the darkness. He could see Volkov and one of the Russians climbing into a small launch trying to follow. And he could see another boat's engines starting. FBI agents, probably Hendricks, commandeering PT-701 to give chase. Bill made a decision. He lunged for the throttles and yanked them back to idle. The engines protested, the boat slowing rapidly. Chen screamed and tried to push the throttles forward again. They struggled, neither willing to give ground. "Listen to me," Bill shouted. "I know these boats. I commanded PT-1 May 14, the boat you built. It saved my life at Lady Gulf. When that shell hit us, your hull held together long enough to save 9 men." Chen stared at him, hands frozen on the throttles. PT-114. Her voice was barely a whisper. The hull held. Against all odds, it held. 3 men died that day, but 9 of us lived because you knew your job. Because you cared enough to do it right. Bill's voice gentled. "I've been trying to save as many boats as I can. It's not enough, I know that. But stealing them isn't the answer. You'll just prove everyone right who says we don't need them." Tears were running down Chen's face now. "They killed my brother, a PT boat he was on. It broke apart when a destroyer rammed it. If it had been built better, if someone had cared more, he'd still be alive. I found a logbook, you know. It mentioned boats disappearing. PT-347, PT-563. I thought that's what Volkov wanted. I thought we were saving history. Your brother died because war is hell, not because of bad construction. And yes, boats disappeared. Operation Redwood. 9 boats transferred illegally to fight communists in China. The government's secret, not yours to expose or exploit." Bill softened his voice. "What happens now is up to you. But know this, you stop right now. You cooperate with FB. Maybe you get a deal. Maybe. You keep running, you're a traitor forever." The fishing boat was getting closer. Bill could see men on deck now, definitely armed. Behind them, PT-701's engines roared to life. Hendricks had commandeered it, was coming after them. Chen looked at the fishing boat, then at Bill, then at the throttles under her hands. "What happens if I stop?" she asked quietly. "FB, I takes you into custody. You'll be questioned, probably charged with theft of government property, aiding foreign espionage. But you cooperate, you tell them everything about Volkov. Maybe you get a deal. Maybe. Or I keep going and at least save 1 boat. 1 boat that will be stripped and studied in a Soviet shipyard and then scrapped anyway because they don't need the actual boat. They need the knowledge, and you'll never see your family again. The NKVD doesn't give people new lives. They use them up and throw them away." Chen's hands trembled on the throttles. The fishing boat was close enough now that Bill could see faces. Hard men with weapons ready. PT-701 was closing from behind Hendricks, pushing her hard. And somewhere in the darkness, a new sound emerged. The deep horn of a Coast Guard cutter, still distant, but getting louder. Margaret Chen looked at Bill one more time, really looked at him, searching his face for something. Truth maybe, or hope, or just a reason to believe that surrender wasn't the same as failure. Then she pulled the throttles all the way back and shut down the engines. PT-658 coasted to a stop, wallowing in the waves. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Bill pulled her away from the helm gently, firmly. "FBI is going to come aboard in about 30 seconds. When they do, tell them you were coerced. Tell them Volkov threatened your family. Stick to that story." But he didn't truly threaten them directly. He just made it clear what would happen if I refused. "Then that's coercion. Stick to it." PT-701 came alongside with a crash of hulls. Hendricks jumped across, gun drawn, 2 agents behind him. "Commander Ashford, step away from the suspect." Bill raised his hands and moved back. Hendricks grabbed Chen, pulled her arms behind her back, cuffed her wrists. She didn't resist, just stood there, tears still falling, looking at the boat that now would never sail free. "Margaret Chen, you're under arrest for theft of government property, conspiracy to commit espionage, and aiding foreign agents. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right." The rest of Hendricks' words were drowned out by automatic gunfire. The fishing boat had opened up on them, desperate to either rescue Chen or silence her. Bullets tore through mahogany, shattered glass, ricocheted off metal fittings. Everyone dove for cover. Bill pulled Chen down behind the engine room bulkhead, shielding her with his body. Hendricks and his agents returned fire, their pistols pathetically outmatched by the fishing boat's weaponry. Then the Coast Guard cutter arrived, searchlights, blazing .50 caliber machine gun, opening up with a sound like the world tearing apart. The fishing boat tried to run, made it maybe 200 yards before the Coast Guard's gunfire shredded its engines. It wallowed to a stop, burning in 3 places, crew jumping overboard and swimming desperately for shore. The whole engagement lasted 90 seconds. When the shooting stopped, Bill's ears were ringing so loudly he could barely hear Hendricks shouting orders to his men. He looked down at Chen. She was curled in a ball, shaking blood on her face from where flying splinters had cut her cheek. "Are you hit?" Bill asked. She shook her head mutely. "Then listen carefully. When they question you, remember what I said. Coerced, threatened. You were trying to protect your family. You thought he was just a buyer for salvage materials. You didn't know he was Soviet intelligence until tonight. Can you remember that? Why are you helping me?" Bill looked at the boat around them. PT-658 still intact despite the gunfire. Still floating despite everything that had just happened. "Because you built PT-114, right?" he said simply. "Because you cared enough to do the job properly even when nobody was watching. That counts for something." Coast Guard sailors boarded from the cutter. More FBI agents arrived. Someone put a blanket around Chen's shoulders and led her away. Hendricks approached Bill, holstering his weapon. "Hell of a night, Commander. Did we get Volkov?" "Spotted him swimming toward shore about 5 minutes ago. Lost him in the darkness. He's probably already on his way to the Soviet consulate to claim diplomatic immunity. We'll find him eventually, but my guess is he'll be on a plane to Moscow within 48 hours. And the Russians from the dock. One dead, one in custody, one escaped with Volkov." Coast Guard Oidian is fishing survivors out of the water from the fishing boat. "We also recovered some interesting equipment before it sank. Soviet naval radio gear, encrypted communications equipment, weapons, and what looks like payment in U.S. currency. $50,000, Commander. That's what they were paying Chen." Bill looked toward the Coast Guard cutter where Chen sat wrapped in a blanket flanked by agents. $50,000. Enough to save her father. Enough to change her family's life. Enough to betray everything she'd built. "What happens to her?" Bill asked. Hendricks shrugged. "That's above my pay grade now. Weston's already talking about classification national security keeping this quiet. Could be 20 years in federal prison. Could be a deal if she cooperates fully and we can bury the whole thing. Depends what the prosecutors want and what the State Department says about making this public." He paused. "You think she was coerced?" "I think she was desperate, and someone with training knew exactly how to exploit that desperation. Soviets are good at that." Hendricks looked at PT-658 floating peacefully now, despite the bullet holes. "How's the boat?" Bill examined the damage. 3 bullets through the hull, all above waterline. Shattered windscreen, some electrical damage. Fuel gauge showing 3/4 full probably would have given them 2 hours at full throttle before running dry. Nothing that couldn't be repaired. "She'll live. They build them tough." "Good, because this one's evidence now. We'll need it for whatever comes next." If there was a trial, Bill thought, if this didn't all get buried under layers of classification and diplomatic convenience. But he kept that thought to himself. The Coast Guard towed PT-658 back to port. I took Margaret Chen away in handcuffs. The sun rose over Port Everglades, revealing bullet casings and bloodstains, and the wreckage of what might have been the first major Soviet espionage operation of the new Cold War. Bill stood on the dock as they loaded Chen into a car. Their eyes met one last time through the window. He saw fear there, regret, but also something else. A question, maybe. Did saving 9 men on PT-114 balance out trying to steal PT-658? Bill didn't have an answer. He just watched the car drive away, taking with it a woman who had built boats with pride and destroyed her life with desperation. And he thought about the 812 boats still waiting for judgment. Some would survive. Most would die. And now at least one would become evidence in a case that might never see a courtroom. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the fog. Bill walked back to PT-658 and ran his hand along the mahogany hull, feeling the grain, the craftsmanship, the care that had gone into every plank. Margaret Chen had built boats like this, had poured her skill and heart into vessels that saved lives and won battles. And when the country was done with those boats, when it was ready to throw them away like garbage, she had tried to save one. Bill couldn't decide if that made her a traitor or a patriot. Maybe she was both. Maybe in the end they all were. The black site wasn't on any map. Located in a repurposed warehouse near Key West, it existed in the gray space between FBI jurisdiction and CIA operations, where people could be held without lawyers or phone calls or any of the protections that supposedly made America different from the places it had just finished fighting. Margaret Chen sat in a concrete room with one table, two chairs, and a light bulb that buzzed like an angry wasp. She'd been there for 6 hours, or maybe 12. Without windows, time became elastic, meaningless. The door opened. A man entered carrying a folder and a cup of coffee he didn't offer to share. Carter Weston. She recognized him from the dock, from those final chaotic moments before the shooting started. He'd been the one directing operations, making decisions, the one everyone deferred to despite wearing no uniform and carrying no badge. Miss Chen, he sat down across from her, opening the folder. Let's talk about Alexei Volkov. I want a lawyer. Of course you do. Everyone wants a lawyer, but here's the situation. Weston leaned back, studying her like a biologist examining an interesting specimen. You're being held under the Espionage Act of 1917. That means we can detain you indefinitely as a threat to national security. No trial, no lawyer, no habeas corpus. You'll sit in this room until you're 80 years old if that's what it takes to protect this country. That's not legal. Define legal. Weston smiled without warmth. We just fought a war against fascism. Turns out, fighting monsters sometimes means becoming a little monstrous yourself. You helped a Soviet intelligence officer attempt to steal military property. That makes you an enemy combatant, Miss Chen. And enemy combatants have very few rights. Maggie felt something cold settle in her chest. This man wasn't bluffing. The folder in front of him probably contained her entire life. Every mistake, every vulnerability, every pressure point that could be exploited. I didn't know he was NKVD, she said quietly. He told me he was a maritime consultant, said he wanted to buy salvage materials for yacht construction. And you believed him. Why wouldn't I? People were buying materials. The Navy was selling everything. It seemed legitimate. Weston opened the folder and pulled out photographs. They showed Maggie loading the bronze propeller into her truck, showed her meeting Volkov at a diner, showed her accepting an envelope that presumably contained money, showed her entering the warehouse. We've been watching you for 10 days, Miss Chen. Ever since Commander Ashford requested a background check and we discovered Volkov had been asking about you. We have documentation of 5 meetings. We have recordings of conversations. We know he paid you $3,000 in advance, promised $47,000 more when the job was complete. Maggie's hands clenched in her lap. My father is dying, cancer. We can't afford treatment. I needed the money. Lots of people need money. They don't commit treason. I wasn't committing treason. I was saving a boat. One boat out of 800, a boat that nobody wanted that would have been scrapped anyway. Weston's expression didn't change. That's an interesting perspective. Let me offer another one. You conspired with a foreign intelligence service to steal advanced military technology. The boat itself was secondary. What Volkov wanted was knowledge. Hull design engine, specifications, construction techniques. Information that would allow the Soviet Union to build their own P-2 boat fleet. Information that could cost American lives in the next war. There isn't going to be another war. We just finished one. And you think Stalin will be satisfied with half of Europe, that he'll just stop expanding, that the alliance will hold? Weston laughed harsh and bitter. Miss Chen, the next war already started. It's just being fought with the espionage instead of armies. And you picked the wrong side. Maggie felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. She'd cried enough, in the boat, after the shooting, during the long ride in handcuffs. She wouldn't cry for this man. What do you want from me? The truth. Every conversation with Volkov, every promise he made, every detail about his operation. You give us that completely and honestly, and maybe we can work something out. And what kind of something? Weston closed the folder. That depends on how cooperative you are and how much trouble you want to cause. Before Maggie could respond, the door opened again. Another man entered, this one in Navy uniform. Commander Ashford, looking like he hadn't slept in days. I need to speak with the prisoner, Bill said. Weston stood. Commander, this is a CIA interrogation. You don't have authorization to interfere with intelligence operations. I have authorization from Admiral Breckenridge. Miss Chen worked on boats under my disposal program. I need to verify certain technical details for my report. Bill met Weston's gaze steadily. Unless you want me to call the Admiral and explain why CIA is preventing Navy from completing its official investigation. It was obviously a bluff, but Weston studied Bill for a long moment, then shrugged. 5 minutes, and I'll be right outside. Don't try anything foolish, Commander. He left, closing the door behind him. Bill sat down in the chair Weston had vacated. He looked at Maggie, really looked at her, and she saw something unexpected in his eyes. Sympathy. How are they treating you? He asked quietly. Like a traitor. Are you, Maggie met his gaze. I don't know anymore. I thought I was just trying to save something worth saving. But maybe I was lying to myself. I did find that logbook, you know. PT347 and PT563 disappearing. I thought it meant something. Thought maybe what Volkov wanted was connected to whatever secret the Navy was hiding. It was, but not the way you think. Bill glanced at the door, lowering his voice further. Weston is CIA, not FBI. That means this is bigger than just theft of government property. They're going to offer you a deal. What kind of deal? The kind where you disappear, new identity, new life somewhere far away, in exchange for your complete silence about everything that happened. No trial, no publicity, no embarrassing questions about why the Navy was scrapping boats, while the CIA was illegally transferring others to foreign governments. Maggie stared at him. What are you talking about? Bill told her. About Operation Redwood. About 9 PT boats given to Chinese nationalists to fight Mao's forces. About Congressman Malone's warning. About Weston's threats to keep him quiet. So they'll cover it up, Maggie said when he finished. Make me the villain to protect their secret. Probably, unless you take the deal. Disappear quietly. Let everyone think you're dead or deported or locked away forever. In exchange, you get to live. That's not living. That's just existing somewhere else. Bill was silent for a moment. Then he pulled something from his pocket and placed it on the table. The ship's wheel from PT-114. Mahogany brass fittings worn smooth by hands that had gripped it through combat. One of the pieces she'd salvaged and hidden before Dutch could destroy it. I took this from your storage before FBI seized everything, Bill said. I wanted you to have it back. Proof that you cared about these boats, that you tried to save something. Maggie touched the wheel, gently feeling the grain of wood she'd shaped years ago. Why are you helping me? I tried to steal a boat. I endangered lives. I betrayed my country. You built PT-114, right? Bill interrupted. When that 5-inch shell hit us in Leyte Gulf, your hull held together long enough to save 9 men. I was one of them. Whatever else you've done, that still matters. Does it? Or is it just guilt that makes you want to believe it matters? Bill smiled sadly. Maybe both, but I'm going to try something anyway. I'm going to recommend to Breckenridge that you be treated as a victim of foreign manipulation rather than a willing conspirator. That you were coerced through threats to your family and financial desperation. That you cooperated fully once you understood the true nature of the operation. Will it work? I don't know, but it's the truth, isn't it? Volkov did target you specifically. He did exploit your desperate situation. And you did stop the boat when you could have kept running. Those are facts. The interpretation is what matters. Maggie looked at him for a long moment. What happens to the boat Pete 658? Evidence locker, at least until the State Department decides whether prosecuting you causes more problems than it solves. And after that, Bill hesitated. Probably scrapped. Can't use it for training, now too much political liability. Can't sell it, same reason. It'll end up in a breaker's yard like all the others. So everything was for nothing. Not nothing. You reminded people that these boats matter, that the people who built them poured heart and skill into every plank. That's worth something, even if the boat itself doesn't survive. The door opened. Weston stood there, expression unreadable. Time's up, Commander. Bill stood, leaving the ship's wheel on the table. Think about what I said, Miss Chen. Sometimes survival is its own victory. Then he was gone, and Maggie was alone with Weston again. Interesting conversation, Weston said, sitting back down. The commander seems to have taken a liking to you. That's fortunate. His testimony could be helpful when we finalize your situation. When you decide whether to make me disappear, you mean? Weston smiled. Let's talk about your options. The interrogation lasted another 4 hours. Maggie told them everything about Volkov, every meeting, every conversation, every promise and payment. She had nothing left to hide and no energy left to maintain lies. She told them about the logbook, about PT-347 and PT-563, about thinking the secret boats were connected to what Volkov wanted. Weston's expression tightened at that, but he didn't comment. When it was over, Weston laid out the deal. Here's what's going to happen. You'll plead guilty to theft of government property in a closed proceeding. No trial, no publicity. Meaning, I will recommend a suspended sentence based on coercion and cooperation. You'll serve no jail time. Instead, you'll accept relocation under a new identity to a location we choose. You'll have no contact with family or friends. You'll never speak publicly about any of this. In exchange, you get to live. What about my father, my mother? They'll be told you died in a boating accident, body lost at sea, tragic but final. The Navy will provide a small pension as compensation for your wartime service. Your mother will be taken care of financially. You want me to let my parents think I'm dead. I want you to understand the price of the choices you made. This is the best deal you're going to get, Miss Chen. Take it or spend the next 20 years in federal prison. Your choice. Maggie looked at the ship's wheel Bill had left behind, looked at her hands calloused and scarred from years of building boats that the country was now throwing away like garbage. Can I write them a letter or a letter to tell them I love them? Weston considered. One letter, heavily redacted for security, delivered after your official death certificate is filed. Those are the terms. Maggie nodded slowly. Then I accept. Good decision. Weston stood. Welcome to your new life, Miss Chen. Or should I say, Maria Callahan. That's your new name. Irish immigrant war widow heading to New Zealand to start over. You leave in 3 days. After he left, Maggie sat alone in the concrete room holding the ship's wheel and trying to remember what it had felt like to build something beautiful. The memories wouldn't come. All she could feel was the weight of what she'd lost in the hollow space where her future used to be. 3,000 miles north in a cluttered office that smelled of coffee and regret, William Ashford typed his final report on the PT boat disposal program. It had taken 19 months instead of 18. Budget overruns of $40,000, conflicts with the State Department, WWII, and CIA, one espionage incident that had nearly triggered a diplomatic crisis. And at the end of it all, out of 812 boats, only 34 survived. Bill had categorized them all. Category A boats preserved for training and museums. Category B boats sold to allies like Norway, Denmark, and the Philippines, most of which would be scrapped within 5 years anyway. Category C boats dismantled for parts and materials. Category D boats scuttled in deep water or used for target practice. The numbers were brutal. 778 boats destroyed. Millions of board feet of mahogany turned into furniture and housing. Thousands of Packard engines sold to commercial operators or racing boat enthusiasts. Tons of bronze fittings melted down for scrap. And 9 boats that officially never existed at all. Bill had tried to get answers about Operation Redwood, had written letters to congressmen, filed reports with the Navy Inspector General, even contacted newspaper reporters who specialized in military matters. Every inquiry hit a wall. Classification, national security, executive privilege. The boats had disappeared into the same shadows that had swallowed Margaret Chen. In the end, Bill had done the only thing he could. He wrote a letter to President Truman detailing everything. The illegal transfers, the cover-up, the espionage attempt, the sacrifice of one woman's life to protect bureaucratic secrets. He mailed it on April 15, 1947. The response came 3 weeks later. Not from Truman, but from an assistant deputy secretary of something or other. The letter was brief. Your concerns have been noted and investigated. No wrongdoing was found. This matter is now closed. Further inquiries will be considered insubordination. Bill read the letter twice, then fed it into his office fireplace and watched it burn. That same day, he submitted his resignation from the Navy, effective immediately. Admiral Breckinridge accepted it without comment. Now Bill sat at his desk, for the last time looking at the files that represented 2 years of his life. 2 years of choosing which boats lived and which died. 2 years of watching history be thrown away because keeping it was inconvenient. He thought about Margaret Chen wherever she was now, hoped she'd found some kind of peace in her new life. hoped the ship's wheel brought her comfort. But mostly he thought about PT 114 Long, since scrapped, reduced to planks in a furniture warehouse somewhere in New Orleans. That boat had saved his life, had kept 9 men alive long enough to be rescued, and he'd repaid that debt by signing the order that sent it to the breakers. Except, Bill pulled out a piece of paper from the bottom of his drawer, a letter he'd received 3 days ago, forwarded from an old Navy buddy who'd been stationed in Manila. Bill thought you'd want to know. Saw something strange last week. A PT boat in Subic Bay, couldn't see the number clearly, but it was an Elco 80-footer. Local fishermen said it belonged to Chinese nationalists, been operating around here since '46. Engine sound was distinctive, made me think of PT-114. Probably wasn't, but wanted to mention it. Stay safe, Jim. Bill had read that letter a dozen times, trying to decide if he believed it. PT-114 was listed as Category C disposal, dismantled at New Orleans in March 1946. He'd seen the paperwork, signed it himself, but he'd also seen paperwork for 9 boats that supposedly didn't exist anymore. If one boat could vanish into covert operations, why not another? Bill wanted to believe it. Wanted to think that the boat Margaret Chen had built with such care hadn't died in a breaker's yard, but had lived on, continuing to serve, justifying every hour she'd poured into its construction. He'd probably never know the truth, but the hope mattered anyway. Bill picked up his bow of personal belongings, and walked out of Philadelphia Naval Yard for the last time. He didn't look back at the handful of boats still waiting in the harbor. Couldn't bear to. The years passed like water through cupped hands. Margaret Chen, now Maria Callahan, arrived in Auckland, New Zealand in April 1947. The CIA had been thorough. She had documentation, a backstory that held up under scrutiny, and enough money to survive for 6 months while she found work. She settled in a small apartment near the harbor and found a job at a boatyard building fishing vessels. The work was familiar. Mahogany hulls, careful joins, attention to detail that separated good boats from death traps. But it wasn't PT boats. Would never be PT boats again. She kept the ship's wheel from PT 114 hidden in her closet, taking it out sometimes when the loneliness became unbearable, running her hands over wood she'd shaped in another lifetime. In 1950, she met Thomas Callahan, a widowed fisherman with kind eyes and no interest in her past. They married quietly, had a daughter, Sarah, in 1953. Maggie never told Thomas the truth. Let him believe the cover story. Irish immigrant war widow looking for a fresh start. It was easier than explaining how she'd betrayed everything she believed in for money and ended up with nothing. But sometimes late at night when her family slept, she'd take out the ship's wheel and remember building boats with pride. Remember her brother Johnny killed on a vessel that should have saved him. Remember Commander Ashford's words. That saving 9 men balanced against her mistakes. That the work mattered even when the boats didn't survive. She wanted to believe it. Mostly she just felt empty. William Ashford returned to Michigan and opened a small boatyard in 1948. Nothing fancy. Recreational vessels, fishing boats, the occasional custom job for wealthy clients who wanted something special. He never built anything resembling a PT boat. Couldn't. His marriage fell apart in 1952. His wife had married a naval officer, not a small-town carpenter, haunted by boats that no longer existed. She left for California with their daughter. Bill didn't fight it. But in 1960, when veterans started organizing reunions and preservation efforts began, Bill threw himself into the work. He wrote letters to museums, contacted collectors, tracked down the 34 surviving boats, and fought to keep them from being scrapped. PT 617 became his special project. He spent 3 years restoring it, replacing rotted planks, rebuilding engines, bringing it back to something like its wartime glory. In 1963, he donated it to Battleship Cove Museum in Massachusetts, where it still sits today, one of only 12 PT boats preserved worldwide. Bill never forgot Margaret Chen. Wondered sometimes if she was alive, if she'd found happiness, if she still thought about the boats. He hoped she had. Hoped she'd made peace with choices that had no good answers. In 1975, at a PT boat veterans reunion in Washington, an old sailor approached Bill with a story. "Sir, did you ever serve on PT 114? "I commanded her," Bill said, "from 1942 through 44. "Why?" The sailor, gray-haired and bent with age, smiled. "I was engineer on PT 347. Different boat, but we were in the same flotilla for a while in 43. I remember PT-114. Beautiful boat. Tightest construction I ever saw. She was scrapped in 46. New Orleans. That's the official story. The sailor lowered his voice. But I heard something different from a buddy who ended up in the Philippines after the war. Said he saw PT-114 operating with Chinese nationalist forces in 48. Still running, still fighting. Last he heard, she'd evacuated to Taiwan when the communists won. Might have served with Republic of China Navy into the early 60s. Bill stared at him. PT-114 was listed as Category C disposal. I saw the paperwork. Signed it myself. Paperwork lies sometimes, especially when CIA is involved. I'm just telling you what I heard. Maybe it's true, maybe it ain't. But I like to think some of our boats are still out there, still working, still doing what they were built to do. Bill thought about that conversation for years afterward. Thought about the possibility that PT-114 hadn't died in a breaker's yard, but had lived on, had continued serving, had justified Margaret Chen's craftsmanship for another 15 years. He wanted to believe it. Never knew for certain. But the hope mattered anyway. Bill died in 1980 at age 72 of a stroke. In his will, he left funds to maintain PT-617 and support PT boat preservation efforts. His funeral was small. A handful of veterans attended. One of them, a former crewman from PT-114, gave the eulogy. Commander Ashford loved these boats more than anything except the men who sailed them. He fought to save them. And even when he couldn't save them all, he never stopped believing they mattered. That's the kind of officer we needed. That's the kind of man we'll miss. Alexei Volkov returned to the Soviet Union in March 1946, part of a prisoner exchange disguised as diplomatic courtesy. The NKVD questioned him extensively about the failed operation in Florida. Why had he involved the American woman? Why had he allowed FBI surveillance? Why had the operation been compromised? Alexei answered truthfully. The American woman had been necessary for her expertise. FBI surveillance had been unavoidable given the scope of the operation. The compromise had come from sources he couldn't control. The NKVD decided he'd done his best under difficult circumstances. His punishment was reassignment to Severodvinsk, working on submarine development. Siberia in all but name. A frozen exile for a failed mission. But Alexei didn't complain. He threw himself into work, applying lessons learned from PT boats to Soviet fast attack craft design. The P-class torpedo boats that emerged in the 1950s owed much to his research combining German E-boat technology captured in the Baltic with American design principles he'd observed. He never received official credit. His name appears in no Soviet naval history, but the boats existed, and they worked. Alexei thought about Margaret Chen often during those long Siberian years. Wondered if she'd survived the American legal system, if the FBI had shown mercy, if she'd found some kind of life after betrayal. In 1968, retired and living in a small apartment in Leningrad, Alexei wrote a letter he never sent. Maggie, I do not know if you will ever read this. I do not even know if you are alive. But I wanted you to know that I am sorry. Sorry for using you. Sorry for putting you in danger. Sorry for destroying whatever life you had built. You were a good person caught in a bad situation, and I exploited that ruthlessly. It is something I have never forgiven myself for. I hope wherever you are that you have found peace, that you have built something beautiful again. That you remember the boats we both loved, even if loving them cost us everything. With regret and respect, Alexei. He kept the letter in a drawer until he died of a heart attack in 1982, age 70. His son found it while clearing out the apartment, read it without understanding the context, and filed it away with other papers that eventually made their way to naval archives. The letter wouldn't surface again for 42 years. PT 658, the boat Margaret Chen had tried to steal, sat in an evidence locker for 6 months, while lawyers and diplomats argued about what to do with it. The arguments were complex. If they tried Margaret Chen, publicly questions would be asked about why the boat had been fueled and ready to sail, about Operation Redwood, about CIA operations that Congress had never authorized. If they buried the case, questions would be asked about why a Soviet espionage attempt wasn't being prosecuted. In the end, they chose a third option: no trial, no publicity. Margaret Chen disappeared into a new identity. The case was classified at the highest levels, and PT-658 became an embarrassment nobody wanted to acknowledge. In October 1946, a Navy demolition team towed PT-658 into the Atlantic coordinates 28 degrees north, 75 degrees west. They placed C4 charges in the hull, evacuated to a safe distance, and triggered the detonation. The boat sank in 12 minutes, settling onto the ocean floor 6,200 feet below the surface. The cold water and lack of oxygen preserved it remarkably well. The mahogany hull built to last by craftsmen who cared remained largely intact. The three Packard engines sat frozen in place, waiting for a hand that would never again touch the throttles. The bullet holes from the Coast Guard firefight were still visible, dark punctures in otherwise pristine wood. In 2019, a privately funded underwater archaeology expedition discovered the wreck during a survey of deepwater sites. They sent down a remotely operated vehicle and captured stunning footage. PT-658 lay on its side, covered in silt nameplates still visible. The mahogany had weathered the decades better than anyone expected. You could still see the craftsmanship in every plank, every join, every detail. The expedition wanted to salvage it, bring it to the surface, restore it, put it in a museum as testimony to the early Cold War and the forgotten stories of the people who built these magnificent boats. The Navy blocked the attempt, classified it as a war grave despite no casualties, refused to issue permits. The real reason, whispered in Pentagon hallways, was that too many secrets still clung to that hull. Operation Redwood, the espionage attempt, the gray area operations that blurred lines between legal and necessary. Better to let it rest in darkness. Better to let history stay buried. But history has a way of refusing to stay dead. In 2024, Sarah Callahan, age 71, sat in her Auckland home and made a decision that would have terrified her mother. She was going to tell the truth. For years after Maria Callahan's death in 1995, Sarah had honored her mother's wishes, had kept the secret, had maintained the fiction that Maria was exactly who she claimed to be. But then Sarah found the memoir. Hidden in a locked box beneath her mother's bed, written in precise handwriting on yellowed paper, was the whole story. Margaret Chen, PT boats, Alexei Volkov, the theft attempt, the betrayal, the forced exile, and the ship's wheel from PT-114, carefully preserved in bubble wrap, proof that at least part of the story was true. Sarah had spent months verifying details, cross-referencing dates with declassified documents, tracking down surviving veterans who remembered things they weren't supposed to talk about, contacting naval archives, finding files that had been sealed for 70 years but were now slowly being released. The story held together. More than that, it mattered. Her mother hadn't been a traitor in the way the government had painted her, hadn't been a willing spy, had just been a desperate woman who loved the boats she'd built and couldn't bear to see them destroyed, who'd been expertly manipulated by a foreign intelligence officer who knew exactly which pressure points to push. That story deserved to be told. Sarah contacted a documentary filmmaker in the United States, a woman who specialized in forgotten stories of World War II and its aftermath. Provided the memoir, the ship's wheel photographs, her mother had hidden everything. The filmmaker spent 18 months researching, interviewing, obtaining footage of PT-658's wreck site from the 2019 expedition. She tracked down James Ashford Bill's son, who provided his father's papers, including letters about Margaret Chen. She found Dmitry Volkov, Alexei's grandson, who provided the unsent letter from 1968. The documentary, The Last Flotilla: Untold Story of PT-658, premiered on Netflix in June 2024. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Boat veteran groups demanded official recognition for Margaret Chen's contributions to the war effort. Naval historians called for declassification of all Operation Redwood documents. Civil liberties organizations pointed to her case as an example of government overreach during the early Cold War. New Zealand offered posthumous citizenship acknowledgement for Maria Callahan, honoring her years of service to their maritime industry. And in August 2024, the United States Navy issued a statement. The case of Margaret Chen represents a complex period in American history where operational security and individual justice came into conflict. While we cannot reverse decisions made 78 years ago, we acknowledge Ms. Chen's contributions to the war effort and regret the circumstances that led to her exile. Her work on 47 PT boats, including vessels that saved countless American lives, deserves recognition. Effective immediately, the Navy will restore Margaret Chen's name to all honor rolls, establish a scholarship fund for women in naval engineering in her memory, and commission a comprehensive historical review of all World War II PT boat operations, including previously classified programs. It wasn't justice exactly. The dead couldn't enjoy vindication, but it was acknowledgement. Recognition that the story mattered, that the people mattered, that history was more than just dates and battles and official records that hid uncomfortable truths. In October 2024, a ceremony was held at Battleship Cove Museum, Massachusetts, where PT-617 sat preserved, one of the last survivors of the 812 boats that had once existed. Sarah Callahan flew from New Zealand, bringing the ship's wheel from PT-114. James Ashford, 75, represented his father William, who had died in 1980, never knowing whether his efforts to help Margaret Chen had mattered. Dmitry Volkov, 60, came from Russia carrying his grandfather Alexei's unsent letter, wanting to acknowledge his family's role in what had happened. 12 surviving PT boat veterans attended, all over 90, most in wheelchairs, but determined to see this moment. The ship's wheel was installed on PT-617's helm during the ceremony, a permanent memorial to the woman who had built boats with such care. James Ashford spoke first, his voice steady despite the weight of history pressing down on them all. My father believed that PT boats weren't just wood and metal. They were the souls of the people who built and operated them. Margaret Chen poured her soul into 47 boats. Though she's gone, her legacy lives in every preserved vessel, every modern patrol craft, every engineer inspired by her story. She tried to save what she loved when the government wanted to throw it away. That's not a crime. That's the most human thing possible. And my father spent the rest of his life trying to right the wrong that was done to her. Dmitry Volkov spoke next through a translator, his words carefully chosen. My grandfather, Alexei Volkov, carried regret until his death. He wrote in his unsent letter that Margaret Chen was the most talented person he ever met, and he destroyed her life for political purposes he didn't even fully believe in. Today, on behalf of my family, I apologize. And I celebrate the legacy she left behind, not just for America, but for all who appreciate skilled craftsmanship and the courage to resist waste. She was a victim of the Cold War, caught between powers that cared nothing for individual lives. Sarah Callahan was last to approach the microphone. She didn't give a prepared speech, just placed her hand on the ship's wheel. Her mother had shaped 80 years ago, felt the grain of the wood under her palm, and wept. When she could speak, she said simply, my mother wrote in her memoir that she hoped someone would remember that the work mattered, that building things with care and skill has value, even when the things themselves don't survive. Today you've given her that. Thank you. The ceremony ended with a moment of silence. 12 ancient veterans, the last living men who had sailed peat boats in combat, rose from their wheelchairs with help from their families and saluted. The American flag rippled in the October wind, and somewhere 6,200 feet beneath the Atlantic, PT-658 rested in eternal darkness, a monument to choices made and prices paid, and the thin line between duty and betrayal that everyone who lived through those years had walked. That night, Sarah sat alone in her hotel room overlooking Boston Harbor, where PT-617 floated illuminated by spotlights, and read her mother's final words from the memoir one more time. I built 47 boats during the war. Most were destroyed after turned into furniture and fishing vessels and forgotten things. But I like to think that somewhere in the wood of houses that shelter families and the engines of boats that bring food to shore and the memories of men who sailed them and lived because of them, those boats still exist. Not as they were, but as they mattered. I made mistakes. I paid for them. I spent 50 years in exile, living under a false name, never seeing my parents again, never returning to the country I'd tried to serve by building the best boats I could. But I never stopped believing that the work itself was good. That building something with care and skill and love has value, even if the thing itself doesn't survive. Even if everything falls apart. Even if you lose everything trying to save what you loved. I hope whoever reads this understands. I hope they know I tried. I hope they forgive me for not being strong enough to resist when I should have. And I hope they remember that even in failure, even in exile, even in loss, the work still mattered. The boats still mattered. Building them right still mattered. That has to be enough. It's all I have left. Sarah closed the memoir and looked out at the harbor, where PT-617 sat preserved, teaching new generations about a war most of them knew only from history books. Her mother's ship's wheel was aboard now, part of history, part of memory, part of the legacy that refused to die even when the people who created it were long gone. And Sarah understood finally what her mother had tried to say across the decades. The boats mattered because the people mattered. The work mattered because the care mattered. Legacy wasn't about the objects surviving. It was about the impact they had while they existed and the ripples that spread from every moment of creation, every choice, every sacrifice. Margaret Chen had built 47 boats that saved countless lives. Only 12 PT boats survived worldwide from the original 812. But the idea of them, the memory of them, the lessons they taught about speed and courage and doing more with less, those lived on in every modern patrol craft, every fast attack vessel, every naval architect who studied World War II small craft tactics. The boats were gone, scattered to furniture and fishing vessels and the bottom of the sea. But the legacy remained. Sarah fell asleep that night thinking about her mother's hands shaping mahogany into curves that would cut through water and bring sailors home, thinking about sacrifice and redemption and the weight of choices made in desperate times, thinking about how history was never as simple as heroes and villains, but always more complicated, more human, more heartbreaking than official records admitted, and thinking that maybe, just maybe, her mother would be proud that the truth had finally come to light, that the boats were finally remembered, that the work at last had been acknowledged as mattering. The last flotilla had sailed into darkness decades ago, most destroyed, a few preserved, one resting forever beneath the waves. But the wake they left behind still touched the shore, still mattered, still remembered. And that, Sarah decided as dawn broke over Boston Harbor, was memorial enough.